She gave birth to a black baby, and her husband walked out that very night accusing her of infidelity. But the truth behind her daughter's birth is far more shocking than she ever imagined. Years later, a DNA test reveals the real father, a convicted murderer claiming he was framed. Was her child the result of a tragic fertility mistake? And what terrifying secret does the DNA evidence uncover? This is a story of betrayal, heartbreak, and an extraordinary fight for justice. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. The evening light filtered through the hospital window, casting a warm glow across the delivery room. Marianne Taylor lay exhausted but radiant, her dark hair damp with perspiration against the starched white pillowcase. The hours of labor had been intense, but now, as she cradled her newborn daughter in her arms, every moment of discomfort faded into insignificance. The rhythmic beeping of monitors provided a gentle backdrop to this precious moment. "She's perfect," Marianne whispered, running a gentle finger along Ruby's tiny cheek. The baby's skin was soft as silk, her little fists clenched tight as she let out small, mewling cries. Marianne's heart swelled with a love so profound it brought tears to her eyes. She counted each perfect finger and toe, memorizing every detail of her daughter's precious face. Robert stood beside the bed, his face glowing with pride as he peered down at his daughter. "Look at those tiny fingers," he said, reaching out to touch Ruby's hand. The baby instinctively gripped his finger, causing him to chuckle with delight. "She's got quite a grip already." His wedding ring glinted in the warm light as he stroked Ruby's tiny palm. The nurse, a kind-faced woman in blue scrubs, moved efficiently around them, checking monitors and making notes on her clipboard. Her shoes squeaked softly against the linoleum floor as she worked. "Time for a quick checkup," she announced cheerfully, reaching for Ruby. "We'll have her back to you in no time, Mama." Marianne reluctantly released her daughter, already missing the warm weight in her arms. She watched as the nurse carefully placed Ruby in the mobile bassinet, her maternal instincts making her heart race slightly at even this brief separation. The wheels of the bassinet squeaked softly as the nurse rolled it toward the examination area. Robert's demeanor shifted subtly as the nurse tended to Ruby under the examination light. His smile faltered, and his posture stiffened. The warmth in his eyes dimmed as he watched the nurse clean and measure their daughter. Marianne, still floating in the euphoria of new motherhood, didn't notice the change at first. She was too absorbed in watching every movement her daughter made, counting tiny toes and memorizing every detail of Ruby's precious face. When the nurse returned Ruby to Marianne's arms, Robert had retreated to the window. His earlier warmth had vanished, replaced by an unsettling silence. The setting sun cast long shadows across his face as he stared out at the parking lot below. Ruby's soft cries drew Marianne's attention as she adjusted the blanket around her daughter, marveling at how complete she felt holding this tiny miracle. The tension in the room grew heavier as evening settled in. The nurse's visits became less frequent, and Robert's silence deepened. He paced near the window, his shoes making soft shuffling sounds against the floor, throwing occasional glances at Marianne and Ruby that grew increasingly dark. The hospital corridor outside grew quieter as night shift began. Finally, as Marianne was beginning to drift into an exhausted sleep, Robert's voice cut through the quiet room like ice. "How could you?" he demanded, his words barely above a whisper but sharp with accusation. His hands were clenched into tight fists at his sides. Marianne's eyes flew open, confusion clouding her tired mind. "What?" The happiness of moments before evaporated like morning dew. "Look at her skin tone," Robert hissed, gesturing toward Ruby. His face was a mask of betrayal and hurt. "She's not mine. She can't be mine." The words hit Marianne like a physical blow, stealing her breath. "Robert, what are you saying? Of course she's yours." Her voice quivered with desperation and disbelief. "Don't lie to me." His voice trembled with barely contained fury. The vein in his temple pulsed visibly. "Who was it? One of your fellow teachers? How long have you been making a fool of me?" Marianne clutched Ruby closer, her heart pounding against her ribs. "I haven't been with anyone else, Robert, please. You're not thinking clearly. I would never—" Her words caught in her throat as tears threatened to fall. "Save it," He cut her off, his face twisted with hurt and anger. "I trusted you, Marianne. I believed in us." He grabbed his jacket from the chair, his movements sharp and aggressive. The chair scraped loudly against the floor. "I can't even look at you right now." Before Marianne could respond, Robert stormed out of the room, the door slamming behind him with a finality that shattered the peace of the evening. The sound echoed down the quiet hallway and made Ruby startle and cry, her tiny face scrunching up in distress. The monitors beeped steadily in the background, a stark contrast to the emotional chaos of the moment. Marianne's tears fell freely now, dropping onto the soft hospital blanket wrapped around her daughter. She pulled Ruby closer, breathing in her sweet, newborn scent, her voice breaking as she whispered, "I don't know what's happening, but I promise I'll protect you." The night settled around them, mother and daughter alone in the sterile hospital room, while outside the window, stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Morning sunlight streamed through the hospital window, casting long shadows across the linoleum floor. Marianne's eyes fluttered open, her arms still protectively wrapped around Ruby, who slept peacefully against her chest. The room felt cavernous without Robert's presence, his empty chair a stark reminder of last night's painful confrontation. Even his coffee cup from the previous evening remained untouched on the windowsill, a bitter testament to his abrupt departure. Ruby stirred, making tiny sounds that already tugged at Marianne's heart. Despite her exhaustion and emotional turmoil, Marianne found herself smiling at her daughter's delicate features. Her tiny fingers curled and uncurled in sleep, a gesture so innocent it made Marianne's chest ache. The morning nurse entered with a cheerful knock, pushing a cart of supplies. "Good morning, Mrs. Taylor. How are you and little Ruby doing today?" The nurse's smile was warm, but Marianne noticed her eyes lingering a fraction too long on Ruby's skin tone. The woman's practiced cheerfulness couldn't quite mask her curiosity. "We're doing fine," Marianne replied softly, adjusting Ruby's blanket. She slept well. She smoothed the pink cotton blanket, the one she and Robert had picked out together at the baby store just weeks ago. Another nurse joined them, offering congratulations while checking Marianne's vitals. Their polite conversation couldn't mask the subtle glances they exchanged, the unspoken questions in their eyes. Marianne focused instead on Ruby, who was beginning to show signs of hunger, her little mouth making rooting movements. "Would you like help with feeding?" the first nurse offered, demonstrating the proper position with practiced hands. Marianne nodded gratefully, pushing aside her awareness of their curiosity. As Ruby latched on for the first time, Marianne felt a surge of connection that brought fresh tears to her eyes. The sensation was both foreign and deeply familiar, as if her body had always known this moment would come. Once alone, Marianne reached for her phone on the bedside table. Her hands trembled as she dialed Robert's number. The call went straight to voicemail. "Robert, please," she whispered into the phone, her voice catching. "We need to talk about this. Call me back." The silence that followed her words felt deafening. She tried again 20 minutes later, then again. Each unanswered call felt like another crack in her heart. Between attempts, she stared at their photos together on her phone. Robert surprising her with flowers on her birthday, both of them beaming at their wedding, his face lit with joy when she showed him the positive pregnancy test. The images blurred as tears filled her eyes. The memory of that moment was particularly painful now. Robert had lifted her off her feet, spinning her around their kitchen, tears of happiness in his eyes. They'd struggled with infertility for so long, enduring countless doctor's appointments and fertility treatments. The calendar in their kitchen had been marked with red circles and crosses, tracking every attempt, every disappointment, every hope. How could he now believe she would have betrayed him after everything they'd been through together? A different nurse entered with discharge paperwork, explaining postpartum care instructions and scheduling follow-up appointments. She spoke about bleeding patterns and warning signs, about proper rest and hydration. Marianne nodded mechanically, her mind stuck on the thought of returning to their empty house. The home they'd so lovingly prepared for their baby's arrival now felt like an uncertain destination. The yellow nursery walls they'd painted together seemed to mock her now, Ruby squirmed in her arms, letting out a small cry that immediately pulled Marianne from her spiraling thoughts. Looking down at her daughter's face, Marianne felt a surge of determination through her fear. This tiny being needed her to be strong, regardless of what challenges lay ahead. Ruby's needs were simple and immediate: love, comfort, nourishment, and Marianne could provide those things. The morning wore on, marked by more unanswered calls and kind but curious hospital staff. Marianne changed Ruby's diaper, marveling at how natural it felt despite her racing thoughts. Her hands seemed to know exactly what to do, even as her mind wandered. She memorized every detail of her daughter's face: the curve of her nose, the shape of her eyes, the softness of her cheeks. Each feature was perfect, regardless of how she came to be. Standing by the window, Marianne held Ruby close as her daughter drifted off to sleep, her tiny breaths warm against Marianne's neck. The world outside continued as normal: cars moving through the parking lot, people walking along the sidewalks, clouds drifting across the sky. But Marianne's world had shifted dramatically in the span of a single night. Everything she'd thought was certain had crumbled, leaving only this one undeniable truth: her love for her daughter. "It's just us now, sweet girl," she whispered to Ruby's sleeping form, pressing a gentle kiss to her forehead. "We'll figure this out." The words were both a promise and a prayer. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the hospital parking lot as Marianne carefully strapped Ruby into her car seat for the first time. Her hands trembled slightly as she double-checked each buckle and strap, making sure her precious daughter was secure. Ruby's tiny fingers reached up, grasping at the air, her dark eyes wide with curiosity. The new car seat still had that fresh plastic smell, a purchase they'd made with such joy just weeks ago. "There we go, sweetheart," Marianne whispered, her voice wavering. "All nice and snug." She tucked the soft pink blanket around Ruby's legs, smoothing it with gentle touches. The drive home felt surreal. Usually, the 20-minute journey passed quickly with Robert beside her, filling the car with conversation about his day at work or their plans for the weekend. Now, only Ruby's occasional soft coos broke the heavy silence. Marianne gripped the steering wheel tighter, forcing herself to focus on the road ahead rather than the empty passenger seat. Each familiar landmark they passed seemed to mock the happiness she'd felt driving this same route just days ago. As she turned onto their street, her heart sank at the sight of their empty driveway. Robert's familiar blue sedan was gone, confirming her fears that he hadn't returned home. The house looked different somehow, less welcoming, its windows dark and uninviting. The cheerful yellow daffodils she'd planted along the walkway seemed out of place now. Marianne gathered Ruby in her arms and fumbled with her keys at the front door. The house felt cold, despite the spring warmth outside. Everything was exactly as they'd left it when rushing to the hospital 2 days ago. Robert's coffee mug still sat unwashed by the sink, and the morning paper lay folded on the kitchen table. These ordinary objects now felt like artifacts from a different life. The family photos on the wall seemed to stare back at her, memories of happier times frozen in their frames. Walking upstairs to the nursery, Marianne's eyes welled up at the sight of the crib Robert had so proudly assembled just weeks ago. She could still picture him following the instructions with determined concentration, insisting on doing it himself because "my baby deserves the best." His face had beamed with pride when he'd finally finished it. Now, laying Ruby down in that same crib felt like a cruel reminder of how quickly everything had changed. The mobile above slowly turned, playing its gentle lullaby to an audience of one. After unpacking her hospital bag, Marianne wandered into the kitchen for a glass of water. That's when she saw it, a single sheet of paper on the counter, Robert's neat handwriting stark against the white surface. The note was brief, just 7 words that hit her like a physical blow. "I need time to think. Don't contact me." The paper still held the indent of his pen strokes, showing how hard he'd pressed while writing. Marianne's legs felt weak as she sank into a kitchen chair, the paper crumpling in her trembling hands. The finality of those words left her breathless, but Ruby's sudden cry from upstairs pulled her back to the present moment. The sound was like an anchor, tethering her to what mattered most. Moving through her grief, Marianne focused on the immediate tasks at hand. She changed Ruby's diaper, marveling at how such a simple act could require so much concentration when done through tears. As she rocked Ruby to sleep, the familiar motion became almost meditative, helping her find a moment of peace in the chaos of her emotions. The nursery's soft yellow walls seemed to wrap around them protectively. The day crept by slowly as Marianne adjusted to her new reality. Each time she looked at Ruby's peaceful face, she found a little more strength. The quiet house that had initially felt oppressive gradually became a sanctuary where she could focus solely on her daughter's needs. She went through the motions of feeding, changing, and comforting, finding purpose in these simple acts of motherhood. As evening approached, Marianne settled into the nursery's rocking chair, holding Ruby close. The baby's warm weight against her chest provided comfort she desperately needed. Looking down at her daughter's sleeping face, she whispered, "I don't know how, but we're going to get through this." The last rays of sunlight filtered through the nursery window, painting mother and child in a gentle golden glow. Sunlight filtered through the nursery curtains as Marianne blinked awake, her body aching from a night spent alternating between feeding Ruby and pacing the quiet halls. The house felt impossibly large and empty without Robert's presence. Ruby's soft breathing from the bassinet beside her bed was the only sound that kept her grounded, a gentle reminder that despite everything falling apart, this precious life still needed her. Marianne reached for her phone, her fingers hovering over Robert's number before scrolling to her OBGYN's contact instead. Her throat felt tight as she dialed the number, her hand trembling slightly as she pressed each digit. "Dr. Harper's office, how can I help you?" The receptionist's cheerful voice answered. "This is Marianne Taylor," she managed, her voice scratchy from lack of sleep and held back tears. I need to speak with Dr. Harper. It's urgent." The receptionist must have heard the desperation in her voice because she quickly arranged an afternoon appointment. Marianne spent the morning in a fog, going through the motions of caring for Ruby, feeding, changing, rocking, while watching the clock crawl toward their appointment time. Each minute felt like an hour as she tried to keep her racing thoughts at bay. At 2 o'clock, Marianne sat in Dr. Harper's familiar office, cradling Ruby close to her chest. The same motivational posters and medical diagrams that had witnessed her years of fertility struggles now seemed to mock her uncertainty. She could still remember sitting in this very chair, month after month, clinging to hope with both hands. Dr. Allison Harper entered with her usual warm smile, though it faded as she noticed Marianne's red-rimmed eyes and slumped shoulders. "Marianne, what's wrong?" The concern in her doctor's voice broke something inside Marianne. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she explained everything: Ruby's birth, Robert's accusations, his absence, and her growing fears. Her words tumbled out in a rush as if finally giving voice to them might somehow make them less painful. "I don't understand," Marianne whispered, wiping her eyes with her free hand while holding Ruby closer. "We tried for so long to have a baby. The fertility treatments finally worked, but now—" Dr. Harper listened intently, her expression thoughtful as she leaned forward in her chair. "Marianne, I know this is difficult, but I think we should consider doing a DNA test. It would give us concrete answers." Marianne's heart clenched at the suggestion, each beat feeling like it might shatter her chest. Part of her wanted to refuse, to pretend everything was fine, but she knew she needed the truth, for Ruby's sake and her own. "How soon can we do it?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the hum of the office air conditioning. As Dr. Harper explained the process, Marianne's mind drifted to the years of trying to conceive. She remembered the disappointment each month, the countless doctor's appointments, the hormone treatments that left her emotional and exhausted. Through it all, Robert had been her rock, holding her hand during procedures and wiping away her tears after each negative pregnancy test. His steady presence had made the journey bearable, even in their darkest moments. The memory of their shared joy when the fertility treatment finally worked felt like a knife in her heart. They had been so happy, so full of hope for their future family. Now, that same treatment that had given them their miracle might hold answers to questions she never thought she'd have to ask. Questions that threatened to unravel everything they'd built together. Looking down at Ruby sleeping peacefully in her arms, Marianne gently stroked her daughter's tiny hand, marveling at the perfect little fingers that curled instinctively around her own. Whatever the answer is, I'll face it. For both of us. Marianne sat at her desktop computer, her coffee growing cold beside her as she stared at the unopened email from the DNA testing facility. Ruby's gentle breathing carried through the baby monitor, the peaceful sound at odds with the storm of anxiety in Marianne's chest. Her heart pounded so hard she could feel it in her throat. Her finger hovered over the mouse, trembling slightly. One click would reveal the truth she both craved and dreaded. The past week had been a blur of sleepless nights and unanswered calls to Robert, each ring met with deafening silence. Now finally she had a chance for answers, though she wasn't sure she was ready for them. "Just do it," she whispered to herself, squeezing her eyes shut for a moment before opening them and clicking. The web page loaded slowly, the spinning circle taunting her as each second stretched like an hour. When the results finally appeared, Marianne's hands began to shake uncontrollably. She read the first line once, twice, 3 times, but the words wouldn't make sense. Her mind refused to process what she was seeing, as if trying to protect her from the truth. Paternity exclusion. Robert Taylor is not the biological father of Ruby Taylor. Below that devastating line was another shock. Genetic match identified. Darnell Pierce. Marianne's stomach lurched violently and she tasted bile at the back of her throat. The name sparked an immediate recognition. She'd seen it in the newspaper just months ago. A man convicted of murder, sentenced to life in prison. Her mind flashed to the headlines, the grim details of the case that had captured the city's attention for weeks. "No, no, no," she muttered, scrolling frantically through the document, her mouse clicking desperately. The scientific terminology blurred before her eyes. Genetic markers, DNA sequences, probability percentages. But the conclusion remained unchanged, stark, and undeniable. Her precious daughter shared DNA with a convicted murderer. She grabbed her phone and dialed Dr. Harper's office with trembling fingers, nearly dropping it twice. The wait for the doctor to come to the phone felt endless, each ring echoing in her ears like a warning bell. "Marianne?" Dr. Harper's familiar voice was warm with concern. "I was expecting your call. I saw the results come in this morning." "The results?" Marianne choked out, her voice barely above a whisper. "They have to be wrong. They're saying Ruby's father is a man in prison. A murderer. Please tell me there's been some mistake." "I've reviewed the results myself," Dr. Harper said gently, compassion evident in every word. "The genetic match is definitive. Given your history with the fertility clinic, there's really only one explanation. There must have been a mix-up during the procedure." Marianne pressed her free hand against her mouth, suppressing a sob that threatened to turn into a scream. How could this happen? How could they make such a terrible mistake? Unfortunately, while rare, these kinds of errors can occur. I strongly recommend contacting the fertility clinic immediately. They need to investigate this situation thoroughly. The sound of Ruby stirring came through the monitor, her familiar rustling bringing Marianne back to reality. Her soft whimpers grew stronger, signaling the end of her nap. Marianne thanked Dr. Harper numbly and ended the call, her fingers feeling thick and clumsy. She sat at the kitchen table, the printed test results spread before her like a nightmare made real, each page a fresh blow to her understanding of her life. The morning sun streaming through the windows seemed too bright, too normal for such an earth-shattering moment. Ruby's cries grew more insistent, filling the house with their urgent need. "This can't be real, but what if it is?" Marianne whispered to the empty kitchen, her voice breaking on the last word. Ruby's wails finally pulled her from her daze, and she stood on shaky legs, gripping the edge of the table for support. She had to find out the truth, no matter how terrifying it might be. Her daughter deserved nothing less. The doorbell's harsh ring cut through the quiet evening, startling both Marianne and Ruby. Through the peephole, Marianne saw Robert standing on the porch, his jaw set in a hard line, his shoulders rigid with tension. Her heart began to race as she opened the door, instinctively holding Ruby closer to her chest, feeling her daughter's warmth against her racing heart. "We need to talk," Robert said, pushing past her into the house with such force that she had to steady herself against the wall. The familiar scent of his cologne, once comforting, now made her stomach churn with anxiety. The same cologne she'd given him last Christmas when everything had been normal and whole. "Robert, I'm glad you're here. There's something I need to explain," Marianne began, but Robert cut her off with a sharp wave of his hand, his wedding ring catching the light. "Save it," he snapped, pacing in their living room like a caged animal, his shoes leaving marks on the carpet they'd picked out together. "I've had time to think, and everything makes sense now. The late nights at school, the weekend planning sessions, you've been lying to me this whole time, haven't you?" Marianne's chest tightened, each breath becoming harder to draw. "No, Robert, please listen. I got the DNA results back. There was a mix-up at the fertility clinic." "A mix-up?" Robert's laugh was bitter and cold, echoing off the family photos that lined their walls. "That's what you're going with? A mix-up?" He ran his hands through his hair in frustration, his fingers leaving deep furrows. "Do you think I'm stupid?" Ruby began to whimper, sensing the tension in the room, her tiny fists clenching and unclenching. Marianne gently bounced her, trying to keep her calm, humming softly under her breath. "I have proof. Let me show you the results." She carefully placed Ruby in her bassinet and retrieved the printed test results from her desk, the paper already worn from how many times she'd read it herself, trying to make sense of it all. Her hands trembled as she handed them to Robert. He snatched the papers, his eyes scanning the document with growing fury, his face reddening with each line he read. "Darnell Pierce?" His voice rose sharply, making Ruby flinch. "The murderer? Are you serious with this nonsense?" He crumpled the papers in his fist, the sound of crinkling paper unnaturally loud in the tense room. "You expect me to believe our fertility clinic accidentally used a convicted killer's specimen? This is the most ridiculous cover story I've ever heard." "It's not a story, Robert. I was just as shocked as you are. We need to investigate what happened at the clinic." "No, what we need is a divorce lawyer." Robert's shout made Ruby start crying in earnest, her wails piercing the air. "You've not only been unfaithful, but you've connected our daughter to a violent criminal. Do you have any idea how dangerous this is? What kind of mother are you?" Tears welled in Marianne's eyes, blurring her vision. "I've never been unfaithful to you. Never." Her voice quivered with the weight of her truth. "Then admit it," Robert demanded, stepping closer, his shadow falling over her. "Admit you're lying about this fertility clinic story, and maybe we can work something out. Otherwise, I'm filing for divorce and full custody. No judge will let Ruby stay with a mother who's linked to a murderer." "I won't admit to something that isn't true," Marianne said, her voice breaking like glass. "I love Ruby, and I love you. Why can't you trust me?" "Trust you?" Robert's face contorted with disgust, transforming the features she'd once found so handsome. "Look at our daughter. The evidence is right there." He gestured wildly at Ruby's bassinet, where she continued to cry. "You've destroyed everything we built together with your lies." He stormed toward the door, pausing with his hand on the knob, his knuckles white with tension. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer. I won't let my daughter be raised by someone like you." The door slammed behind him with such force that the pictures on the wall rattled, one falling to the floor with a crack of broken glass. Marianne collapsed onto the couch, her body shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the depths of her soul. She gathered Ruby into her arms, holding her close as tears fell onto her daughter's soft blanket, creating dark circles on the pale pink fabric. "I didn't do anything wrong," she whispered brokenly, stroking Ruby's cheek, feeling the softness of her baby's skin beneath her trembling fingers. "Why can't he see that?" The morning sun filtered through the curtains as Marianne sat at her kitchen table, laptop open and a cold cup of coffee beside her. Ruby slept peacefully in her bassinet nearby, giving Marianne a precious window of time to search for answers. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before typing Darnell Pierce case into the search bar. News articles flooded her screen, their headlines screaming about a brutal murder and a swift conviction. But as Marianne delved deeper, clicking through court documents and witness testimonies, something didn't add up. "This can't be right," she muttered, pulling up the trial transcripts. The key witness had changed their story 3 times during questioning. Another witness placed Darnell at the scene but couldn't describe what he was wearing. The murder weapon was never found. Marianne created a document to track the inconsistencies, her teacher's organizing skills kicking in. The prosecution's timeline had holes large enough to drive a truck through. The alleged motive seemed flimsy at best, a supposed grudge over a workplace dispute that no other co-workers could verify. In one interview from prison, Darnell's words jumped off the screen. "I've never hurt anyone in my life. I was framed, and someday the truth will come out." His eyes in the grainy photo held no malice, only a deep sadness that made Marianne's chest tighten. Ruby stirred, making small cooing sounds. Marianne reached over to stroke her cheek, marveling at how this tiny person had turned her world upside down. "What really happened, sweet girl?" she whispered. With trembling hands, Marianne dialed the fertility clinic's number. After being placed on hold 3 times, she finally reached someone who identified themselves as a patient coordinator. "I need to discuss a serious error that occurred during my fertility treatment," Marianne explained, trying to keep her voice steady. "Ma'am, our protocols are extremely thorough," the coordinator replied, her tone dismissive. "Mix-ups are highly unlikely. But I have DNA proof. If you'd like to file a formal complaint, you can request the forms through our website. However, I must remind you that all patients sign waivers acknowledging—" Marianne hung up, frustration burning in her throat. The clinic's stonewall response only convinced her that something was terribly wrong. She opened a new tab and searched for private investigators in her area, making notes of those specializing in medical cases. The cost would be significant. Money she didn't really have as a single mother, but she needed answers. Not just for herself and Ruby, but perhaps for Darnell too. If he was truly innocent, how many years of his life had been stolen? Marianne pulled up Darnell's statement one more time, studying his words about being framed. His unwavering insistence of innocence over the years struck a chord with her own situation. Being accused of something she didn't do, having her truth dismissed and denied. Ruby began to cry, ready for her morning feeding. As Marianne lifted her daughter from the bassinet, she looked at Darnell's prison interview photo one last time. What if he's telling the truth? What if this goes deeper than I ever imagined? The manila envelope felt heavy in Marianne's hands as she stood in her doorway, staring at the retreating back of the process server. Her fingers trembled as she opened it, though she already knew what she'd find inside. The divorce papers spilled onto her kitchen counter, stark black text on crisp white paper that seemed to mock the life she'd built with Robert. Ruby fussed in her bouncer and Marianne picked her up, needing to hold her close. "It's okay, sweetie," she whispered, though her voice cracked. As she scanned the documents, her heart sank further. Robert wasn't just filing for divorce. He was seeking full custody of Ruby, citing Marianne's moral character and questionable judgment as grounds. 3 days later, Marianne sat in a downtown law office surrounded by leather-bound books and the scent of coffee. Her lawyer, Ms. Bennett, reviewed the papers with a practiced eye. "These accusations are serious," Ms. Bennett said, adjusting her reading glasses. "Robert's claiming your supposed infidelity shows poor judgment that makes you unfit to be Ruby's primary caregiver. The DNA results complicate things further." Marianne clutched her purse tighter. "But I didn't do anything wrong. The fertility clinic made a mistake." "Which we'll need to prove," Ms. Bennett replied, pulling out a legal pad. "We need documentation of all your fertility treatments, every conversation you had with the clinic, and any correspondence with Robert during that time." The lawyer's pen scratched across the paper as she listed what they needed. Character witnesses will be crucial. Fellow teachers, friends, family, anyone who can speak to your integrity and capabilities as a mother. As Ms. Bennett talked strategy, Marianne's mind wandered to Darnell Pierce, the man whose DNA somehow became entwined with her daughter's existence, the man sitting in prison, possibly wrongfully convicted, while she fought to keep the daughter who shared his genes. "There's something else," Marianne interrupted. "I've been researching Darnell Pierce's case. I think he might be innocent." Ms. Bennett's pen stopped moving. "That's not our immediate concern. Involving yourself in his case could give Robert more ammunition. He could argue you're putting Ruby at risk by associating with a convicted murderer. But if he's innocent, focus on one battle at a time," Ms. Bennett advised gently. Right now, we need to protect your rights as Ruby's mother. Back home, Marianne placed Ruby in her favorite spot on the living room floor, surrounded by soft toys. She watched her daughter grab at a stuffed elephant, innocent of the storm swirling around her. The weight of her choices pressed down on Marianne's shoulders. Contact Darnell and risk losing Ruby? Stay silent and let a potentially innocent man remain in prison? The moral implications twisted in her gut like a knife. Sitting alone in her living room, Ruby sleeping peacefully in her arms, Marianne whispered, "I have to protect you, no matter what. But is the truth something we can handle?" The morning sunlight filtered through Marianne's kitchen window, casting long shadows across her worn wooden table. Her coffee had gone cold hours ago, but she barely noticed as she stared at the business card in her hand. James Cooper, private investigator, was printed in simple black text, a number she'd found after hours of online searching. Ruby's soft breaths echoed through the baby monitor beside her. Marianne glanced at the clock, 7:15 a.m. Early, but she couldn't wait any longer. Her fingers shook slightly as she dialed the number. "Cooper Investigations," a deep voice answered on the third ring. "Mr. Cooper, this is Marianne Taylor." She took a deep breath. "I have a complicated situation that needs investigating." After explaining the basics of her case, James agreed to meet that afternoon. His office was downtown, in an older building with worn carpet and flickering fluorescent lights. But James himself projected calm competence, his gray hair and weathered face suggesting years of experience. "So," he said, gesturing for Marianne to sit in the chair across from his desk, "walk me through everything." Marianne pulled out her folder of documents, the DNA results, fertility clinic records, and printouts of news articles about Darnell's case. As she laid them out, Ruby dozed in her carrier beside her. "The DNA test shows Darnell Pierce is Ruby's biological father," she explained, pointing to the results. "But I've never met him. I conceived through fertility treatments at the Riverside Clinic." James studied the papers, his expression thoughtful. "And you've researched Pierce's case?" "Yes." Marianne pulled out the newspaper clippings. "The evidence against him seems weak. Inconsistent witness statements, no physical evidence linking him to the crime. He's maintained his innocence for years." While James reviewed the documents, Marianne called the fertility clinic again. After being placed on hold 3 times, she finally reached a supervisor. "We understand your concerns, Mrs. Taylor," the woman said, her tone professionally distant, "but our protocols are extremely strict." "Then how did this happen?" Marianne pressed. "I can't discuss specific cases, but—" The supervisor paused. The only unusual circumstance during that period was a temporary technician covering for staff vacation, but they were fully qualified. Back in James's office, the investigator looked up from the papers. "The clinic mix-up and Pierce's conviction might be separate issues, but both need investigating. I'll start with the clinic's records, then dig into Pierce's case files." "Can you help me?" Marianne asked, hope creeping into her voice for the first time in weeks. "I'll do my best," James replied, already making notes. "This won't be quick or easy, but something's not right here. We'll find the truth." As Marianne gathered her things to leave, she felt lighter than she had in weeks. Ruby stirred in her carrier, blinking up at her mother. Standing in the doorway of James's office, Marianne allowed herself to feel the first glimmer of hope since this nightmare began. The morning sun cast long shadows across the fertility clinic's parking lot as Marianne pulled into a space. Her hands lingered on the steering wheel for a moment, gathering courage. In the back seat, Ruby cooed softly in her car seat, blissfully unaware of the tension building in her mother's shoulders. The clinic's waiting room felt different now. Gone was the hopeful excitement Marianne had felt during her treatments. Instead, she sat stiffly in a plush chair, watching other couples flip through magazines and whisper excitedly about their future families. Their joy felt like a knife twisting in her heart. "Mrs. Taylor," a receptionist called out, "Dr. Whitman will see you now." Marianne adjusted Ruby in her carrier and followed the receptionist down a sterile hallway. The click of her shoes against the tile floor echoed her racing heartbeat. Dr. Elaine Whitman's office was immaculate, with framed medical degrees covering one wall, and family photos arranged perfectly on her desk. The doctor herself sat ramrod straight in her chair, her gray suit as crisp as her expression. "Mrs. Taylor, how can I help you today?" Dr. Whitman's tone was professionally distant. Marianne placed the DNA results on the desk. "These show that my daughter's biological father is Darnell Pierce. I need to understand how this happened." Dr. Whitman barely glanced at the papers. "Mrs. Taylor, our clinic maintains the highest standards of quality control. A mix-up of this nature is statistically improbable." "But not impossible," Marianne pressed. "I learned there was a temporary staff member working during my treatment cycle." The doctor's face tightened almost imperceptibly. "We occasionally employ qualified temporary staff to handle increased patient loads. All personnel undergo rigorous background checks and training." "Then you can tell me who was working that day?" "I'm afraid that's confidential information." Dr. Whitman folded her hands on her desk. "Mrs. Taylor, I understand you're upset, but perhaps you should discuss these concerns with your lawyer." "I'm not leaving until I get some answers," Marianne insisted, her voice trembling. Ruby began to fuss in her carrier, picking up on her mother's distress. Dr. Whitman's expression hardened. "If you continue to make accusations without evidence, we'll have no choice but to consider legal action ourselves. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have patients waiting." Marianne stood slowly, gathering Ruby's carrier. The weight of defeat pressed heavy on her shoulders as she walked through the waiting room. Other patients stared as she passed, their curious glances following her to the door. Back in her car, Marianne gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. Tears threatened to spill over as she looked at Ruby's reflection in the rearview mirror. "I won't stop until I find the truth," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly. Ruby blinked back at her, innocent and trusting, completely unaware of the storm swirling around them. A tear finally escaped, rolling down Marianne's cheek as she stared at her daughter's reflection. The morning sun barely penetrated the heavy clouds as Marianne's phone buzzed with James Cooper's call. Her heart raced as she answered, hoping for good news about Darnell's case. "Mrs. Taylor," James's steady voice came through. "I've found something significant. One of the key witnesses from Darnell's trial. Their statement doesn't add up. There's evidence it was coerced." Marianne sank into her kitchen chair, clutching the phone tighter. "Coerced? How?" "Police records show they held the witness for 48 hours without proper documentation, and there are inconsistencies between their initial statement and trial testimony." James paused. "I think you should meet him, Mrs. Taylor. Talk to him yourself." After arranging the visit for the next day, Marianne spent hours pacing her living room, wondering if she was making the right choice. Ruby's babysitter arrived early the next morning, giving Marianne time to compose herself before the drive to the prison. The visiting area was stark and cold, with metal tables bolted to the floor and harsh fluorescent lighting that made everything look sickly. Marianne's hands trembled as she sat waiting, the DNA test results tucked in her purse feeling heavier than paper should. When the guards brought Darnell in, Marianne was struck by how different he looked from his mugshot. His face held a gentle wisdom, his movements careful and deliberate. His orange jumpsuit couldn't hide his dignity. "Mrs. Taylor?" His voice was soft, almost musical. "I'm Darnell Pierce." "Please call me Marianne," she managed, her throat tight with anxiety. She pulled out the DNA results with shaking hands, explaining about the fertility clinic, Ruby's birth, and Robert's reaction. Darnell listened intently, his expression thoughtful. He paused, collecting his thoughts. "I never imagined something like this. But I need you to know, I'm not who they say I am." His story poured out quietly. He described the night of the murder, how he'd been miles away at his sister's house. The police had ignored his alibi, focused solely on him despite the lack of physical evidence. During the trial, the prosecutor had played on racial stereotypes, painting him as an angry, violent man. "The jury saw what they expected to see," he said, his voice steady but sad. "They didn't see a man who coached Little League, who worked 2 jobs to put his daughter through private school." Marianne felt tears welling up. "You have a daughter?" "Elena. She was 12 when they took me away. His composure cracked slightly. She's in college now. We write letters. Throughout their conversation, Darnell never showed anger about his situation. Instead, he asked thoughtful questions about Ruby, her health, her personality, her favorite toys. His genuine concern touched Marianne deeply. "Thank you for coming," he said as their time drew to a close. "For being willing to look past what people say about me. Whatever happens, please know I'm grateful." Walking back through the prison's heavy doors, Marianne felt the weight of everything she'd learned. The man she'd met bore no resemblance to the monster described in news reports. Her whispered words echoed in the empty hallway. "What if I'm the only person who can help him?" The morning light filtered through the kitchen window as Marianne sorted through her mail. Her hands trembled when she spotted the official-looking envelope from Robert's lawyer. Inside, the cold, formal language hit her like a physical blow. "Notice of intent to seek full custody," the letter declared. Marianne's vision blurred as she read further, her chest tightening with each accusation. Robert's lawyer painted her as unstable and reckless, citing her dangerous association with a convicted felon as evidence of her unfitness as a mother. Ruby cooed from her bouncer, oblivious to her mother's distress. Marianne wiped her eyes and called her lawyer, Sarah Bennett, scheduling an emergency meeting for that afternoon. The law office was warm and welcoming with soft lighting and comfortable chairs. Sarah Bennett, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a sharp mind, listened intently as Marianne explained the situation. "They're trying to use your investigation of Darnell's case against you," Sarah said, her tone serious but gentle. "Robert's team will argue that by involving yourself with a convicted murderer, you're putting Ruby at risk." Marianne clutched her purse tighter. "But Darnell might be innocent. The evidence James found—" "I understand," Sarah interrupted softly. "But right now, we need to focus on protecting your rights as Ruby's mother. We need to gather evidence of your stability and capability as a parent." Sarah pulled out a legal pad and began listing what they needed. Character references from colleagues at the school where Marianne taught, documentation of Ruby's regular medical checkups, proof of a stable home environment, and financial records showing Marianne could provide for her daughter. "What about Darnell's case?" Marianne asked quietly. Sarah's expression softened. "I admire your commitment to justice, Marianne, but we need to be strategic. Any involvement with Darnell's case needs to be carefully managed. Robert's team will be watching for any misstep." That evening, alone in her house, the weight of her situation crashed over Marianne. She sat on her couch, surrounded by the paperwork Sarah had given her, feeling overwhelmed by the dual battles she faced. Fighting for custody of Ruby while trying to help an innocent man seemed impossible. Ruby's cry pierced through her thoughts. Marianne rushed to the nursery, lifting her daughter from the crib. As she rocked Ruby gently, humming a lullaby, the baby's warm weight against her chest grounded her. Ruby's tiny fingers wrapped around Marianne's thumb, and in that moment everything became clear. Through the night, Marianne moved through the familiar routine of caring for Ruby, feeding, changing, soothing. Each small task reinforced her determination. She was a good mother, and she would prove it. No court could deny the love and care she provided for her daughter. Standing by Ruby's crib, watching her daughter finally drift off to sleep, Marianne whispered firmly, "No one is taking you away from me. Not now, not ever." Sunlight streamed through the living room windows as Marianne sat cross-legged on her couch, surrounded by stacks of papers. Ruby napped peacefully in her bassinet nearby while Marianne organized her evidence for the upcoming meeting with her lawyer. Her laptop pinged with a new email notification. The subject line read, "Information about your fertility clinic case." Marianne's heart skipped a beat. Usually she'd dismiss an anonymous email as spam, but something made her click it open. "Dear Ms. Taylor," the message began, "I worked at Brighton Fertility Clinic during your treatment. What happened to you wasn't right and I can't stay quiet anymore. I have proof of what went wrong. Please call me 555-1123, Karen Daniels." Marianne read the email 3 times, her hands shaking. She glanced at Ruby, then back at the screen. After checking that Ruby was still sleeping soundly, She grabbed her phone and stepped into the kitchen. She dialed the number, her stomach in knots. The phone rang twice before a soft voice answered. "Hello?" "Hi, this is Marianne Taylor. I just received your email about the fertility clinic." "Oh, thank goodness you called," the woman replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm Karen Daniels. I worked as a lab technician at Brighton for 3 years, including during your treatment." Marianne grabbed a notepad from the counter. "Why are you contacting me now?" "I saw your name in the clinic's internal emails. They're trying to cover up what happened." Karen's voice grew stronger. "During that time, we were severely understaffed. Management pushed us to handle too many cases without proper safety protocols." "What kind of protocols?" Marianne asked, scribbling notes. "Sample tracking, double-checking procedures, proper labeling, everything that prevents mix-ups." Karen paused. "I saw mistakes happen. When I reported them, management told me to keep quiet or risk losing my job." Marianne's hand tightened around her pen. "Did you witness anything specific about my case?" "I have documentation, records showing understaffing on key dates, emails about protocol violations, even photos of improperly stored samples. I kept copies before I left." Karen lowered her voice. "I can't send these electronically. Would you meet me in person?" Marianne hesitated, considering the risks. "How do I know this is legitimate?" "I understand your caution," Karen replied. "Look up my employment records at Brighton. I was there from 2019 to 2022, left 3 months ago." After discussing details, they agreed to meet at Sally's Diner, a quiet place 20 minutes outside town. Karen chose it for its privacy and security cameras. Ruby stirred in the other room, making small waking-up noises. Marianne knew she needed to wrap up the call. "Thank you for coming forward," Marianne said. "This means more than you know." "I should have spoken up sooner," Karen replied. "What the clinic did wasn't just careless. It was wrong." They set the meeting for 7 p.m. that evening. As Marianne hung up the phone, her heart raced with a mixture of hope and apprehension. She hurried to Ruby's side, lifting her daughter gently from the bassinet. "If what she says is true, this could change everything," Marianne whispered. The neon sign of Joe's Diner cast a soft red glow across the nearly empty parking lot as Marianne pulled in. Her hands trembled slightly as she checked her watch. 8:45 p.m. Ruby was safe with her neighbor, Mrs. Peterson, but Marianne still felt anxious being away from her daughter. Inside, the diner smelled of coffee and grilled onions. A few truckers hunched over their plates at the counter, while an elderly couple shared pie in a corner booth. Marianne chose a secluded spot near the back exit and ordered coffee to calm her nerves. At exactly 9 p.m., a woman in her mid-40s with graying brown hair hurried through the door. Her eyes darted around the diner before landing on Marianne. This had to be Karen Daniels. She clutched a worn manila envelope to her chest as she slid into the booth. "Ms. Taylor?" Karen's voice was barely above a whisper. When Marianne nodded, Karen's shoulders relaxed slightly. "I've been wanting to come forward for months, but I was scared. The clinic has powerful lawyers." The waitress approached, but Karen waved her away. She laid the envelope on the table, keeping one hand protectively on top of it. "What I'm about to show you could cost me everything. I signed confidentiality agreements, but I can't stay silent anymore." Karen's fingers trembled as she opened the envelope. "During your treatment week, we were severely understaffed. Management had fired 3 technicians to cut costs, leaving us overwhelmed. Protocols that required double-checking were rushed or skipped entirely." She pulled out several documents, spreading them carefully on the table. Internal memos detailed complaints about understaffing and warnings about potential mistakes. A logbook showed hasty entries and crossed-out notes during the week of Marianne's treatment. "Look here," Karen pointed to an entry dated the day of Marianne's procedure. "Sample mix-up potential with Pierce D. Protocol breach." Her finger traced the hurried scrawl. "I reported this to Dr. Whitman immediately, but she dismissed it. Said we couldn't afford any bad publicity." Marianne's coffee grew cold as Karen revealed more. Other patients had complained about unexpected results, but the clinic quickly silenced them with legal threats and hefty settlements wrapped in non-disclosure agreements. Just then, Marianne's phone buzzed. James Cooper's name flashed on the screen. She almost declined the call. but something made her answer. "Marianne," James's voice crackled with excitement. "I found Marcus Thompson, the witness who claimed to see Darnell at the crime scene. He's been hiding in Cincinnati, eating himself alive with guilt. He just confessed that the prosecutors threatened him with drug charges if he didn't testify against Darnell." Marianne's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes meeting Karen's concerned gaze. Two separate threads of truth were finally coming together, weaving a pattern of injustice that had affected so many lives. Karen gathered the documents, sliding them back into the envelope. "Take these," she said firmly. "Use them to expose the truth. Just, please protect my identity as long as you can. I have a family too." Marianne drove home with the envelope beside her, each streetlight illuminating the worn manila paper like a beacon of hope. In her rearview mirror, Ruby's empty car seat reminded her of everything at stake. "We're getting closer, sweet girl," she whispered. "The truth is coming out." Morning sunlight streamed through the windows of Sarah Bennett's downtown law office, casting long shadows across the mahogany conference table. Marianne sat with perfect posture, though exhaustion lined her face. The manila envelope from Karen Daniels lay open between them, its contents spread across the polished surface. Sarah adjusted her reading glasses, examining a particularly damning memo. "This evidence is compelling, Marianne. The clinic's negligence is clear." She paused, tapping her pen against the desk. "But we need to be extremely careful about how we proceed." "What do you mean?" Marianne leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "The fertility clinic has deep pockets and a reputation to protect. They'll come at us with everything they've got: legal threats, character assassination, possibly even criminal charges for possessing stolen documents." Sarah's voice was gentle but firm. "And Robert's lawyers will use any public scandal to strengthen their custody case." Marianne's stomach churned. "So we just let them get away with it?" "I'm saying we need to be strategic. Right now, Ruby's custody has to be our priority." Back home that afternoon, Marianne watched Ruby playing in her crib, batting at the mobile hanging above her head. Sunbeams danced across her daughter's dark curls, and her happy gurgles filled the nursery. The sight both warmed Marianne's heart and intensified her inner turmoil. She picked up a stuffed elephant from the floor, absently straightening its bow tie. The truth about the fertility clinic could protect other families from similar mix-ups, but would exposing it put Ruby through unnecessary trauma? And what about Darnell spending his days behind bars for a crime he might not have committed? The sharp ring of her phone cut through her thoughts. James Cooper's name flashed on the screen. "Marianne," his gravelly voice came through. "I've been talking to that witness from Darnell's trial. He's ready to come forward about being coerced. This could be the break we need." She sank into the rocking chair, her free hand gripping the armrest. "What does he want?" "He wants to meet you. Hear your side of the story. I think seeing how this affects real people might help him find the courage to go public." "James," Marianne's voice wavered. "Sarah warned me about getting too involved. If Robert's lawyers find out—" "I understand," James interrupted softly. "But sometimes doing the right thing means taking risks. Think about it. This could help both Darnell and Ruby in the long run. Truth has a way of coming out eventually." After hanging up, Marianne remained in the nursery, turning one of Ruby's tiny pink socks over in her hands. The weight of her decisions pressed down on her shoulders like a physical burden. Ruby cooed from her crib, reaching up toward the mobile's dancing butterflies. "What's the right thing to do?" Marianne whispered, her voice barely audible. "How do I protect you and still do what's right?" Sarah Bennett's office buzzed with quiet determination as Marianne settled into the familiar leather chair. The morning light cast a warm glow on the stack of legal papers between them. Ruby slept peacefully in her carrier beside Marianne's feet. "We need to focus entirely on the custody battle right now," Sarah explained, her voice firm but kind. "Robert's lawyers will try to paint you as unstable, especially given the situation with the fertility clinic and Darnell Pierce." Marianne nodded, her throat tight. "What should I do?" "First, we need character references, strong ones, people who can testify to your capabilities as a mother and your stability as a person." Sarah pulled out a notepad. "Think about your colleagues at school, your friends, anyone who's seen you with Ruby." That afternoon, Marianne visited her principal, Mrs. Rodriguez, who immediately agreed to write a glowing reference about Marianne's dedication to her students and her natural nurturing abilities. 3 of her fellow teachers also stepped forward, describing how Marianne had continued planning lessons for her substitute even while on maternity leave. Back home, Marianne created a detailed documentation system. She organized Ruby's medical records chronologically, including every pediatrician visit and vaccination. She collected photos showing their daily routine, feeding times, bath times, story times. Each image captured their strong bond. Marianne cradling Ruby during late-night feedings, their matching smiles during tummy time, peaceful moments in the rocking chair. Her phone buzzed with a text from James Cooper. "Witness willing to meet. Tomorrow?" Marianne's heart raced as she typed back a quick yes. She knew Sarah would advise against it, but she couldn't ignore the chance to help an innocent man. She thought of Darnell's gentle demeanor during their prison visit, so different from what she'd expected. That evening, while Ruby napped, Marianne sorted through more evidence for the custody case. She created a timeline of Ruby's milestones, each one meticulously documented with photos and journal entries. She gathered receipts showing her purchases of baby supplies, proving her financial responsibility and dedication to Ruby's care. Her best friend Emma dropped by with dinner and her own character reference letter. "I've written about how you've wanted to be a mother for so long," Emma said, hugging Marianne. "How you never gave up hope through all those fertility treatments." Marianne's eyes welled up with grateful tears as she added Emma's letter to the growing stack of supporting documents. She felt the weight of her double mission, fighting for custody while secretly working to uncover the truth about Darnell's conviction. Standing in her living room later that night, surrounded by files and photos, Marianne looked at Ruby sleeping peacefully in her crib. The soft glow of the nightlight illuminated her daughter's peaceful face. "I'm going to fight for you no matter what it takes," she whispered, her voice filled with determination. The courthouse loomed before Marianne, its stone steps bathed in morning sunlight. She paused at the entrance, adjusting her navy suit jacket and clutching the thick folder of evidence against her chest. Ruby was with Emma today, and Marianne already missed her daughter's comforting weight in her arms. Inside the courtroom, the polished wooden benches felt hard and unwelcoming. Marianne's heels clicked softly on the marble floor as she made her way to her seat beside Sarah Bennett. Across the aisle, Robert sat rigidly in his dark suit, refusing to meet her eyes. His lawyer, a sharp-featured man in an expensive suit, shuffled through papers with practiced efficiency. "Remember," Sarah whispered, "stay calm no matter what they say. The judge needs to see your stability." The bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise. The Honorable Judge Matthews presiding." As everyone settled back into their seats, Robert's lawyer launched his opening statement. His voice dripped with carefully crafted concern as he painted Marianne as unstable and potentially dangerous. "Your Honor," he declared, "Mrs. Taylor has not only hidden the truth about Ruby's parentage, but has actively sought contact with Darnell Pierce, a convicted murderer. This reckless behavior puts the child at risk." Marianne's hands trembled in her lap, but she kept her face composed. She watched the judge's expression, trying to read any reaction in his neutral features. "Furthermore," Robert's lawyer continued, "Mrs. Taylor's emotional state has become increasingly erratic. She's pursuing conspiracy theories about fertility clinic mix-ups and wrongful convictions instead of focusing on her daughter's well-being." Sarah squeezed Marianne's arm gently before rising to present their case. Her voice rang clear and confident through the courtroom. "Your Honor, what we have here is a dedicated mother who has been Ruby's primary caregiver since birth. Despite Mr. Taylor's abandonment during a difficult time, Mrs. Taylor has maintained a stable, nurturing environment for their daughter." Sarah methodically presented their evidence. She showed photos of the carefully organized nursery, Ruby's detailed care schedules, and medical records documenting every checkup and vaccination. Character references from the school principal and fellow teachers testified to Marianne's responsibility and emotional stability. "Mrs. Taylor has created a consistent routine for Ruby," Sarah emphasized, displaying the daily schedules. "She's maintained her career as a respected teacher while ensuring Ruby receives excellent care. The minor's best interests have always been her priority." The judge reviewed each document carefully, occasionally glancing between Marianne and Robert. His expression remained unreadable as he made notes. "I've reviewed the initial arguments," Judge Matthews finally announced. "We'll reconvene tomorrow morning for additional testimony. Both parties should be prepared to present witnesses." As the courtroom began to clear, Marianne gathered her papers with shaking hands. The weight of the day pressed down on her shoulders, but Sarah's steady presence helped her stay grounded. "You did great today," Sarah assured her as they walked toward the courthouse steps. "Just stay focused, and we'll win this." The morning sun filtered through the courthouse windows as Marianne took her place on the witness stand. Her navy suit felt tight around her shoulders, but she sat up straight, hands folded carefully in her lap. The familiar faces of the courtroom watched her. Sarah's encouraging smile, Robert's stony expression, the judge's neutral gaze. "Mrs. Taylor," Sarah began gently, "please tell us about your journey to motherhood." Marianne took a deep breath, her voice steady but soft. "We tried for 3 years to have a baby. Month after month of disappointment, doctor visits, and tears." She paused, remembering those dark days. "The fertility treatments were our last hope. When I finally got pregnant with Ruby, it felt like a miracle." Sarah guided her through questions about Ruby's birth and early days. Marianne's eyes grew misty as she described holding her daughter for the first time. "She was perfect, is perfect. From the moment I saw her, I knew I would do anything to protect her." When Sarah asked about Robert's accusations, Marianne's voice wavered slightly. "He didn't even give me a chance to explain. He just left us. But I kept going. I had to. Ruby needed me." She described the lonely nights of feeding, changing, and comforting her newborn alone. "And the DNA test results?" Sarah prompted. "I was shocked," Marianne admitted. "But Ruby was still my daughter. Nothing could change that. I pursued answers because she deserves to know the truth about where she came from." Robert's lawyer stood for cross-examination, his tone sharp. "Mrs. Taylor, isn't it true that you've been in contact with a convicted murderer?" "I reached out to Mr. Pierce only after discovering the fertility clinic's mistake," Marianne responded calmly. "As Ruby's mother, I needed to understand what happened. Every child deserves to know their history." "And you don't think this association puts your daughter at risk?" Marianne sat straighter. "No, what puts children at risk is hiding the truth from them. I'm facing this situation head-on, with Ruby's best interests at heart. Always." From her peripheral vision, she noticed Robert shifting uncomfortably in his seat. His usual mask of anger seemed to crack slightly as she spoke about their daughter. "Everything I've done," Marianne continued, her voice clear and strong, "has been to give Ruby the stable, loving home she deserves. I'm there for every fever, every smile, every milestone. I'm not just her mother on paper. I'm there, every single day, being the parent she needs." The courtroom fell silent as she finished speaking. Even the judge seemed moved by her sincerity. Marianne could feel tears threatening, but she held them back, maintaining her composure as she had done so many times these past months. When Sarah indicated she could step down, Marianne rose steadily. Her heels clicked against the wooden floor as she walked past Robert, who couldn't meet her eyes. She took her seat beside Sarah, her heart pounding but her head held high. The courthouse buzzed with tension as Sarah Bennett rose from her seat. "Your Honor, I'd like to call Karen Daniels to the stand." A ripple of whispers swept through the courtroom as Karen emerged from the back, her steps hesitant but determined. Marianne watched as Karen smoothed her gray skirt and took her oath. The former lab technician's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted the microphone, but her voice came out clear and steady. "Ms. Daniels, please tell the court about your employment at the fertility clinic," Sarah began. "I worked there for 3 years as a senior lab technician," Karen explained, her fingers fidgeting with her necklace. "I was there during Mrs. Taylor's treatment period." "And what can you tell us about the clinic's practices during that time?" Karen took a deep breath. "The clinic was severely understaffed. We were handling double our usual patient load, but management refused to hire more help." She reached for the water glass beside her. Corners were cut. Safety protocols were ignored. Sarah approached with a manila envelope. "Your Honor, I'd like to present Exhibit C, internal documents Ms. Daniels preserved from her time at the clinic. The judge nodded, and Sarah distributed copies of the paperwork. Karen identified each document, explaining their significance. This log shows sample handling procedures for the week of Mrs. Taylor's treatment. You can see here, she pointed, where protocols were breached multiple times. Robert shifted uncomfortably in his chair as Karen detailed the clinic's negligence. His lawyer leaned forward, whispering urgently in his ear. "And this memo?" Sarah held up another document. "That's from Dr. Whitman ordering us to process more samples than our safety guidelines allowed." Karen's voice grew stronger. She knew we were overwhelmed, but the profit margins were more important than proper procedures. Robert's lawyer stood abruptly. "Objection, Your Honor. The witness is speculating about management's motivations." "Sustained," the judge replied. "Please stick to what you personally witnessed, Ms. Daniels." Karen nodded. "I documented every violation I saw. When I raised concerns, management threatened my job. They made it clear that speaking up would end my career." Robert's lawyer began his cross-examination with an aggressive tone. "Isn't it true you were fired from the clinic, Ms. Daniels?" "No," Karen replied firmly. "I resigned after witnessing too many ethical violations." "So you harbor resentment toward your former employer?" "My only resentment is toward a system that prioritized profit over patient care." Karen's gaze remained steady. "I'm here because Mrs. Taylor and her daughter deserve the truth." The judge leaned forward, studying the documents. "Ms. Daniels, these records show clear evidence of procedural violations. Why come forward now?" "Because I couldn't live with the guilt anymore," Karen replied softly. "When I saw the news about Mrs. Taylor's case, I knew I had to speak up. These aren't just papers. They're people's lives." The judge nodded thoughtfully, examining the evidence before him. Marianne watched as he made careful notes, hope rising in her chest for the first time in days. As Karen stepped down from the witness stand, her eyes met Marianne's. Marianne mouthed a silent, "Thank you," and Karen responded with a small, encouraging nod. The truth was finally coming to light. The morning sunlight filtered through the courthouse windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor. Marianne sat rigid in her chair beside Sarah, her knuckles white as she clasped her hands together. The wooden benches creaked with tension as the packed courtroom waited for the judge to begin. Robert sat across the aisle, his face drawn and pale, deliberately avoiding looking in Marianne's direction. His lawyer shuffled papers nervously, perhaps sensing the shift in momentum after Karen's testimony. Judge Matthews cleared her throat, adjusting her reading glasses as she lifted a thick folder of documents. "After careful consideration of all evidence presented in the matter of Taylor versus Taylor regarding custody of minor child Ruby Taylor, I am prepared to deliver my ruling." The judge methodically reviewed the key points of the case, her voice steady and measured. "This court has heard testimony from multiple witnesses, including Mrs. Taylor's colleagues, medical professionals, and most notably Ms. Karen Daniels, whose evidence proved instrumental in clarifying the circumstances surrounding Ruby's conception." Marianne held her breath, feeling Sarah's reassuring hand on her arm. The judge continued, "Mrs. Taylor has demonstrated exemplary dedication to her daughter's well-being since birth. The documentation of her daily care routines, medical attention, and emotional nurturing is extensive and compelling." Judge Matthews turned her attention to Robert's allegations. "The court finds no merit in the accusations of infidelity or negligent behavior. The fertility clinic mix-up, while unfortunate, was clearly beyond Mrs. Taylor's control. Her subsequent actions in pursuing the truth demonstrate responsibility rather than instability." Robert's jaw clenched visibly as the judge spoke. His lawyer leaned closer, whispering something that made him shake his head slightly. "Therefore," the judge announced, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed courtroom, "I hereby grant full custody of Ruby Taylor to Marianne Taylor. Mr. Taylor will be entitled to supervised visitation rights to be arranged through the court's Family Services Department." Marianne felt tears welling up in her eyes as relief flooded through her body. Sarah squeezed her hand gently. The judge wasn't finished. She removed her glasses and looked directly at Robert. "Mr. Taylor, I strongly encourage you to work toward establishing a healthy co-parenting relationship with your ex-wife. Ruby deserves to have both parents in her life, but this requires you to move past your unfounded suspicions and focus on what's best for your daughter." Robert remained frozen in his chair, his expression a mixture of shock and anger. His lawyer began writing furiously on a legal pad. As the judge concluded the proceedings, the tension in the courtroom began to dissolve. Sarah gathered their papers while Marianne stood on shaky legs. The victory felt surreal after months of uncertainty and fear. Walking out of the courtroom, Marianne's tears finally spilled over. She held Ruby close to her chest, feeling her daughter's warm weight against her heart. "We did it, baby," she whispered into Ruby's soft hair. "We're safe now." The autumn breeze rustled through the outdoor cafe's awning as Marianne settled into her seat across from James Cooper. Her hands wrapped around a steaming cup of coffee, seeking warmth and comfort. James spread several manila folders across the small table, careful to keep them away from their drinks. "I've organized everything chronologically," James explained, his voice low and steady. "Karen's documents from the fertility clinic create a clear timeline of negligence. Combined with the witness statement about being coerced during Darnell's trial, we have a solid foundation." Marianne nodded, scanning the carefully labeled tabs. "Have you spoken with the witness again?" "Yes, Marcus Thompson is ready to come forward officially." James pulled out a notarized statement. "He's terrified, but remorseful. The pressure the prosecutors put on him weighs heavy on his conscience." They spent an hour reviewing the petition, making sure every detail was precise. James had been thorough, connecting the fertility clinic's misconduct to the larger pattern of systemic failures that had led to Darnell's wrongful conviction. Later that afternoon, they met with Olivia Grant in her downtown office. The lawyer's reputation preceded her. She'd won several high-profile wrongful conviction cases. Her office walls displayed newspaper clippings of her victories, though Marianne noticed they were yellowing with age. Olivia studied the documents with sharp eyes, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. The silence stretched uncomfortably as she read, broken only by the gentle ticking of a wall clock. "This is unexpected," Olivia finally said, looking up at Marianne. "A fertility clinic mix-up connecting to my client's case? It's unprecedented." She tapped her pen against the desk thoughtfully. "But the evidence is compelling, especially the witness recantation." "Will it be enough?" Marianne asked, her voice tight with hope. "Getting a retrial won't be easy," Olivia warned. "The system hates admitting mistakes, but this connection to you and your daughter through the fertility clinic adds a unique angle that might force them to pay attention." James leaned forward. "The clinic's negligence creates reasonable doubt about the original conviction. If they were careless enough to mix up samples, who knows what other mistakes were made?" "Exactly," Olivia agreed. "But you both need to understand. This will attract media attention. A wrongfully convicted man, a fertility mix-up, a mother fighting for justice. Reporters will love this story." Marianne's stomach clenched. "How much exposure are we talking about?" "National coverage, probably. Your privacy and Ruby's will be challenged." Olivia's expression softened. "I know you've just won your custody battle. This could complicate things." Marianne twisted her hands in her lap, thinking of Ruby at home with the babysitter. Her daughter's peaceful life could be disrupted by cameras and reporters, yet the thought of Darnell sitting in prison, wrongfully convicted, made her heart ache. "I understand the risks," Marianne said firmly, "but we need to move forward. Darnell deserves justice." Olivia nodded, gathering the documents. "I'll file the motion for retrial first thing tomorrow. Be prepared. This fight is just beginning." Back in her car afterward, Marianne reached for Ruby's favorite blanket in the back seat. The soft fabric still carried her daughter's sweet scent. She held it close, seeking comfort in its familiar texture. "We're doing the right thing," she whispered into the quiet car. "Justice has to matter." The morning sun filtered through the courthouse's tall windows, casting long shadows across the packed courtroom. Marianne sat in the back row, her heart pounding against her ribs as she watched Darnell Pierce being led to his seat. James Cooper sat beside her, his usual calm demeanor providing silent support. The courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations until Judge Martinez called for order. Olivia Grant, Darnell's attorney, stood confidently at the podium, her dark suit crisp and professional. She began methodically presenting the new evidence, her voice clear and unwavering. "Your Honor," Olivia started, "what you're about to see reveals a grave miscarriage of justice." She gestured to the screen where Karen Daniels' documented evidence from the fertility clinic appeared. The courtroom fell silent as Olivia explained how the mix-up connected to Darnell's wrongful imprisonment. Marcus Thompson, the former key witness, took the stand next. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the wooden railing. "I was scared," he admitted, his voice cracking. "The prosecutors told me if I didn't identify Mr. Pierce, they'd make trouble for my family. I knew it wasn't right, but I felt trapped." Darnell sat perfectly still during the testimony, his shoulders straight despite the weight of 13 years of wrongful imprisonment. Only the slight tremor in his clasped hands betrayed his emotion. Olivia's closing argument resonated through the hushed courtroom. "This case exemplifies how systemic bias and prosecutorial misconduct can destroy an innocent man's life. Mr. Pierce lost 13 years of freedom, separated from his family, branded a murderer, all because of a rush to judgment and coerced testimony." During the recess, Marianne watched Darnell embrace his elderly mother, their quiet tears speaking volumes. The wait felt endless, but finally, Judge Martinez returned to the bench. After reviewing the new evidence, the judge began, her voice steady, "Including Mr. Thompson's recanted testimony and the documented prosecutorial misconduct, I find sufficient grounds to overturn Mr. Pierce's conviction." She paused, looking directly at Darnell. "Mr. Pierce, you are hereby declared a free man." The courtroom erupted in muffled sobs and gasps. Darnell's family surged forward, enveloping him in tearful hugs. His sister cried openly, clutching his arm as if afraid he might disappear. From her seat in the back, Marianne felt tears sliding down her cheeks. James squeezed her shoulder gently. "You did good," he whispered. "You helped make this right." As Darnell made his way toward the courthouse doors, now a free man, he caught Marianne's eye. In that moment of connection, he mouthed a simple, "Thank you." Marianne nodded, her own tears falling freely, knowing they had finally achieved the justice Darnell deserved. Marianne's phone buzzed on her kitchen counter as she prepared Ruby's morning bottle. Seeing Olivia Grant's name on the screen, she answered quickly, wondering what news the lawyer might have so soon after Darnell's release. "Marianne, there's something important you should know." Olivia's voice was gentle but serious. "During my investigation into Darnell's case, I discovered he has another daughter." The bottle slipped from Marianne's hand, thankfully landing softly on the counter. "Another daughter?" "Yes. Her name is Elena. She was placed in foster care after her mother passed away, right around the time of Darnell's arrest. I thought you should know, given Ruby's connection to the family." Marianne sank into a kitchen chair, her mind racing. Ruby had a half-sister somewhere out there. The knowledge felt both wonderful and overwhelming. 2 days later, Marianne met Darnell at Jefferson Park, a quiet spot with scattered benches and towering oak trees. Ruby was with a babysitter, giving them space to talk freely. Darnell sat on a wooden bench, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. "I should have told you about Elena sooner," he began, his voice heavy with regret. "Her mother, Teresa, died from cancer shortly before my arrest. Everything happened so fast. Teresa's death, my conviction. Elena was only 4 years old." Marianne watched a family playing nearby, their children's laughter carried on the spring breeze. "Have you been looking for her?" "Every chance I got from prison," Darnell nodded. "But the system, it's complicated. She was placed in foster care and then I lost track. I think she might have been adopted, but I can't be sure." "How old would she be now?" 17, Darnell replied quickly, the number clearly well worn in his mind. "She'd be 17 last month." Marianne could hear the pain in his voice, years of separation wrapped in those simple words. "I want to help you find her," she said softly. "Ruby should know her sister, and Elena deserves to know the truth about what happened to you." Darnell looked at her with surprise and gratitude. "You'd do that?" "Of course," Marianne nodded. "But I need to be honest with you. I'm worried about moving too fast. Ruby's still so young, and there's been so much change already." "I understand completely," Darnell assured her. "The last thing I want is to disrupt Ruby's life. We can take this as slow as needed. Finding Elena, it might take time anyway." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching people pass by on the park's walking path. Marianne thought about Ruby, barely a year old, and Elena, a teenager who might not even know she had a father fighting to find her. "Do you have any photos of her?" Marianne asked. Darnell reached into his wallet and pulled out a worn photograph. "This is the last picture I have. She was 4. Marianne studied the image of a smiling little girl with bright eyes and braided hair. She tried to imagine that little girl now, a teenager somewhere, perhaps wondering about her past. Standing up, Marianne watched Ruby toddle around the park deep in thought. She resolved to tread carefully, saying to herself, "This has to be about what's best for her, not what's easiest for me." The morning sun filtered through the coffee shop windows as Marianne sat with Darnell, discussing his plans to find Elena. His hands trembled slightly as he looked through private investigator profiles on his laptop. "I worked with James Cooper," Marianne offered, stirring her untouched coffee. "He's thorough and compassionate. That matters when dealing with sensitive family matters." Darnell nodded, making a note. Did he give you hope even when things seemed impossible?" "He did," Marianne smiled softly. "And he delivered on that hope. The truth about Ruby. Your case. He helped uncover it all." 3 weeks passed in a blur of waiting and wondering. When the investigator finally called with news, Darnell immediately reached out to Marianne. They met at the same coffee shop, where he shared the details. Elena had been adopted by the Martinez family in Riverside, just 40 minutes away. She was studying psychology at the local community college. "She's had a good life," Darnell said, his voice thick with emotion. "The investigator says her adoptive parents are kind people. They encouraged her education, supported her dreams." "That's wonderful," Marianne squeezed his hand. "Now you can be part of her future." They spent the afternoon crafting a letter to Elena. Darnell poured his heart onto the page, explaining the circumstances of his wrongful conviction and his constant search for her. Marianne helped him find the right words when emotions made writing difficult. "I want her to know I never stopped loving her," Darnell said, crossing out another line. "But I don't want to overwhelm her." "Just be honest," Marianne advised. "Share your truth and give her space to process it." Elena's response came 2 weeks later. She agreed to meet at a quiet cafe in Riverside, neutral ground for both of them. Marianne drove Darnell there, watching from her car as he walked inside. Through the window, she observed their reunion. Elena, tall and poised, looked so much like her childhood photo. She sat stiffly at first, her shoulders tense. But as Darnell spoke, his hands moving expressively, she began to lean forward, engaged in his words. Tears flowed freely on both sides. Darnell showed Elena photos he'd kept of her mother, of their brief time as a family. Elena shared stories of her life, her studies, her dreams. The wall between them slowly began to crumble. After 2 hours, they emerged from the cafe. Elena's eyes were red, but her smile was genuine as she hugged Darnell goodbye. They exchanged phone numbers and made plans to meet again. Walking back to Marianne's car, Darnell wiped his eyes. "I couldn't have done this without you," he said softly. Marianne smiled, her own eyes misty. "We're all just trying to make things right." The autumn breeze rustled through the backyard trees as Marianne sat on her weathered wooden porch swing, watching Ruby toddle through fallen leaves. Her daughter's delighted giggles filled the air as she discovered each crunchy leaf, holding them up triumphantly. The peaceful moment was interrupted by the buzz of Marianne's phone. Her heart skipped when she saw Robert's name on the screen. They hadn't spoken directly since the custody hearing, communicating only through their lawyers. The message was simple but unexpected. "Can we meet today? The cafe on Oak Street?" Marianne studied Ruby playing in the yard, considering the request. After several minutes, she typed back a careful, "Yes, 3 p.m." Later that afternoon, Marianne walked into the cafe, spotting Robert at a corner table. He looked different, somehow smaller, less intimidating than during their courthouse encounters. His shoulders were hunched and he fidgeted with a paper napkin. "Thank you for coming," he said softly as she sat down. His voice lacked its usual edge of anger. "Why did you want to meet?" Marianne asked directly, keeping her tone neutral. Robert took a deep breath. "I've been doing a lot of thinking and I owe you an apology." He paused, struggling to maintain eye contact. "The way I handled everything when Ruby was born, abandoning you both, accusing you of things I knew weren't true, trying to take her away. I was wrong." Marianne sat quietly, letting his words hang in the air. She watched as he twisted the napkin between his fingers. "My pride got the best of me," he continued. "I was so caught up in what other people might think, in my own insecurities, that I couldn't see what was right in front of me. A beautiful daughter, and a wife who needed my support." His voice cracked slightly. "I've been seeing a therapist. She's helped me understand how my actions hurt both you and Ruby. I know I can't undo what I did, but I want to try to make things right. Not for me, but for Ruby." Marianne took a sip of water, carefully considering her response. "What exactly are you asking for, Robert?" "I want to be part of Ruby's life again," he said. "Not as your husband. I know that bridge is burned, but as her father, as a co-parent who supports your decisions and puts her needs first." Marianne leaned forward, her voice firm but not unkind. "I appreciate your apology, Robert, but you need to understand, things can never go back to how they were. My priority is Ruby's well-being, and that means having clear boundaries." Robert nodded quickly. "I understand. You've been an amazing mother to her, Marianne. I see that now. I'll follow your lead, respect your boundaries, whatever you think is best for Ruby." "We'll need to take things slowly," Marianne explained. "Start with supervised visits, maybe an hour or two on weekends. We'll see how Ruby responds and adjust from there." "That's more than fair," Robert agreed, relief evident in his voice. As they discussed practical details, Marianne noticed the tension in her shoulders beginning to ease. This wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was a step toward something better for Ruby. Driving home afterward, Marianne whispered to herself, "Maybe we can find a way forward, just for her." Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as Marianne helped Ruby into her tiny denim overalls. The toddler wiggled and laughed, making the simple task take twice as long, but Marianne didn't mind. These ordinary moments felt precious now that the custody battle was behind them. "Arms up, sweetie," Marianne said, pulling a purple t-shirt over Ruby's curly hair. The house felt different lately, lighter, as if a heavy cloud had finally lifted. Even the morning routine of getting ready for daycare had a peaceful rhythm to it. At the elementary school where she taught, Marianne's fourth-grade classroom welcomed her back with familiar warmth. Her students' artwork decorated the walls, and the morning announcements crackled over the intercom just like always. She found comfort in writing the day's schedule on the whiteboard, in helping students with their math problems, in the predictable flow of the school day. During lunch break in the teacher's lounge, her colleague Sarah noticed the change in her demeanor. "You seem different lately, Marianne. More relaxed." "You're glowing," added Beth from the science department, stirring her coffee. "It's nice to see you smile again." Marianne nodded, unpacking her sandwich. "I feel lighter. Everything with Ruby is settled now, and I'm just focusing on building our life together. It's amazing how much energy worry takes up, energy I can now put into being present for her and my students." Later that afternoon, while her class worked quietly on their reading assignments, Marianne's phone vibrated with a call from Darnell. She stepped into the hallway to answer it. "Elena and I had dinner last night," he said, his voice warm with happiness. "She showed me photos from her childhood, her graduation. We're taking it slow, but it feels right." "That's wonderful, Darnell," Marianne replied, genuinely happy for him. "I wouldn't have any of this without you," he continued. "You believed in me when no one else would. You helped me get my life back, get my daughter back." That evening, after putting Ruby to bed, Marianne sat cross-legged on her living room floor, surrounded by photo albums and loose pictures. She sorted through images of Ruby's first smile, first steps, quiet moments of them reading together. Each photo told a story of their journey, the hard times, and the joy. She found herself lingering over a recent picture taken at the park. In it, Ruby sat on her lap, both of them laughing at something off-camera. Their happiness was genuine, unguarded. Standing up, Marianne placed the framed photo carefully on the mantel, whispering, "This is just the beginning for us." The kitchen was quiet except for the gentle clink of dishes as Marianne wiped down the counters after dinner. Ruby had gone to bed early, tired from a busy day at daycare. As Marianne moved a stack of mail, her hand brushed against something tucked beneath the fruit bowl, a folded piece of paper, yellowed at the edges. Her heart tightened as she recognized Robert's hurried handwriting. "I need time to think. Don't contact me." The words still had the power to sting, even now. Marianne sank into a kitchen chair, memories flooding back. The confusion and hurt of those early days after Ruby's birth, the crushing weight of abandonment. She traced her finger over the creased paper, remembering how many times she'd read these words through tears. The note had been a turning point, the moment she realized she would have to be strong enough for both herself and Ruby. Walking to her desk, Marianne pulled out a fresh sheet of paper and uncapped her favorite pen. Her hand trembled slightly as she began to write. "Dear Robert, there are things I need to say, even if you'll never read them. When you left that note, you broke more than just my heart. You shattered our family before it had a chance to begin. I spent so many nights wondering what I could have done differently, blaming myself for something that was never my fault." The words flowed freely now, years of pent-up emotions spilling onto the page. She wrote about the lonely nights, the struggle to explain his absence to others, the fear of losing Ruby. But as she continued writing, something shifted. She found herself acknowledging his recent efforts, his sincere apology, his commitment to being present in Ruby's life now, his acceptance of their new dynamic as co-parents. "I understand now that your actions came from a place of fear and insecurity," she wrote. "While that doesn't excuse what you did, I recognize that holding on to this anger only hurts me, and by extension, hurts Ruby." Marianne walked to the fireplace, letter in hand. The flames danced as she carefully tore the pages into strips, both Robert's old note and her new letter. One by one, she fed them into the fire, watching as the words curled and blackened. Each piece that burned seemed to take a small weight off her shoulders. The resentment she'd carried for so long began to dissolve with the ashes, leaving behind a sense of peace she hadn't expected. Marianne watched the last ember fade, the gentle warmth of the fire matching the growing warmth in her heart. She whispered into the quiet room, "It's time to let it go." Sunlight streamed through the kitchen windows as Marianne hung the last streamer, its pink and purple ribbons dancing in the gentle breeze from the ceiling fan. Ruby sat in her high chair, fascinated by the colorful balloons bobbing against the ceiling. Her tiny hands reached up, trying to grab them. "Almost done, sweet girl," Marianne said, adjusting the happy first birthday banner. The vanilla cake she'd baked sat proudly on the counter, decorated with buttercream frosting and a single candle. Next to it, a small pile of wrapped presents waited to be opened. Marianne checked her phone, still an hour before guests would arrive. She'd kept the guest list small, wanting Ruby's first birthday to be intimate and comfortable. The thought of Darnell and Robert both attending had initially made her nervous, but they'd all come so far in the past months. The doorbell rang earlier than expected. It was Robert, looking slightly uncomfortable but holding a neatly wrapped package. "I hope it's okay that I'm early," he said, shifting his weight. "I thought I could help set up." Marianne nodded, appreciating the gesture. They worked together quietly, arranging snacks and putting up the last decorations. Soon after, other guests began arriving. Close friends from work, neighbors who'd supported her through everything, and finally Darnell. Ruby's eyes lit up at all the attention. She bounced in her high chair as everyone gathered around, singing, "Happy Birthday." The cake's single candle cast a warm glow on her delighted face. Marianne noticed how Robert and Darnell both watched Ruby with genuine affection, though they maintained a respectful distance from each other. When it came time for presents, Darnell stepped forward first. He handed Ruby a soft, plush elephant, which she immediately hugged tight. "I remembered you mentioning she likes animals," he said to Marianne with a gentle smile. Robert's turn came next. He passed the wrapped package to Marianne, explaining, "They're books I thought she might enjoy. The librarian recommended them for her age." Inside was a collection of colorful board books carefully chosen. As the afternoon progressed, Ruby grew increasingly excited by all the attention and sugar from her first taste of cake. Frosting covered her cheeks as she giggled, reaching for more. The guests chatted comfortably, sharing stories and cooing over Ruby's attempts to eat with her tiny fork. Needing a moment of quiet, Marianne stepped onto the back porch. Through the window, she could see her living room filled with people who cared about Ruby. Robert was carefully cleaning frosting off Ruby's hands while Darnell gathered discarded wrapping paper. Her friends laughed and took photos, documenting every precious moment. Back inside, it was time for the final birthday tradition. Marianne lifted Ruby from her high chair and held her close as they faced the cake's flickering candle together. The room grew quiet as Marianne leaned forward with Ruby in her arms, both their faces illuminated by the gentle flame. She whispered softly, "May you always know how loved you are." And they blew out the candle together. Rain drummed steadily against Marianne's windshield as she checked her phone one more time, making sure she'd read Dr. Whitman's message correctly. The fertility clinic's familiar brick building loomed ahead, bringing back a flood of memories, both hopeful and painful. Marianne pulled into a parking spot, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly before she reached for her umbrella. Inside the clinic's lobby, the receptionist's welcoming smile seemed different from the dismissive treatment she'd received during her previous visits. "Dr. Whitman is expecting you, Mrs. Taylor. Please follow me." The clinic director's office was smaller than Marianne had imagined, with medical certificates lining the walls and a desk cluttered with patient files. Dr. Whitman stood as Marianne entered, her usual confident demeanor replaced by visible unease. "Thank you for coming, Mrs. Taylor." Dr. Whitman gestured to a chair. "I know our previous interactions haven't been pleasant." Marianne sat down, keeping her expression neutral. "You said you had something important to discuss." Dr. Whitman cleared her throat, shuffling papers on her desk before meeting Marianne's eyes. "Yes, I owe you an apology, a sincere one. Our handling of your case was negligent, and our response to your concerns was even worse." The rain continued its steady pattern against the window as Dr. Whitman explained how internal pressure to maintain the clinic's reputation had led them to dismiss valid concerns. "We were more focused on avoiding scandals than addressing our mistakes. That was wrong." Marianne listened silently, noting the genuine regret in Dr. Whitman's voice. The director pulled out a document from her desk drawer. "We'd like to offer you a settlement, compensation for what you've been through." "I'm not interested in money," Marianne replied firmly. "What I want to know is how you're preventing this from happening to other families." Dr. Whitman nodded, setting aside the settlement papers. "We've implemented new protocols, triple checking of all samples, additional staff training, and better record-keeping systems. We're also conducting an audit of all procedures from the past 5 years." "And the other families? Are you contacting everyone who might have been affected?" "Yes," Dr. Whitman confirmed. "We've already begun reaching out to potentially affected patients. It's not an easy process, but it's necessary." The conversation continued as Dr. Whitman detailed the clinic's reform plans. Marianne asked pointed questions about accountability measures and future safeguards. Throughout their discussion, the tension in the room gradually eased, replaced by a mutual understanding of the importance of preventing future mistakes. As their meeting drew to a close, Dr. Whitman stood and extended her hand. "Again, Mrs. Taylor, I am truly sorry for everything you've endured because of our negligence." Marianne accepted the handshake, feeling the weight of years of anger and confusion beginning to lift. The rain had started to clear as she walked back to her car, patches of blue sky peeking through the clouds. Standing in the parking lot, Marianne took a deep breath of the fresh, rain-washed air and whispered, "We've closed this chapter." Sunlight streamed through the classroom windows as Marianne arranged the chairs for her parent-teacher meetings. The familiar scent of chalk dust and children's artwork hung in the air, bringing a smile to her face. She smoothed her navy blazer and checked her reflection in the window, noting how the dark circles under her eyes had finally faded. "Mrs. Taylor?" Principal Stevens poked her head in. "Your first appointment is here early." "Perfect, thank you." Marianne's voice carried a confidence that surprised even her. Throughout the morning, parents filed in and out of her classroom. She discussed reading levels, math progress, and behavioral observations with practiced ease. The tension that had once knotted her shoulders during these meetings was gone, replaced by a steady assurance in her abilities. "Tommy's really flourished this year," Mrs. Chen said warmly. "He talks about your class all the time." "That means so much to hear," Marianne replied, her smile genuine. "Tommy's creativity in writing has been incredible to watch." During lunch break, Marianne sat with her colleagues in the teacher's lounge. Sarah, who taught next door, passed her a homemade cookie. "You seem different lately," Sarah observed. "More centered, I guess." "I agree," added Mark from across the table. "Whatever you're doing, it's working." Marianne wrapped her hands around her coffee mug. "I think I've finally learned to trust myself. All those battles with Robert, helping Darnell, they taught me what I'm capable of." "You've always been strong," Sarah said. "You just needed to realize it." After school, Marianne settled at her desk with her leather-bound journal. Afternoon light painted golden stripes across the pages as she began to write. "Dear Ruby, today I realized how much we've both grown. The challenges we faced weren't just obstacles, they were opportunities to learn about strength, justice, and forgiveness. I've discovered that healing isn't about forgetting the past, but about choosing how it shapes our future. I've learned that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones most worth fighting. That standing up for what's right isn't always easy, but it's always necessary. Most importantly, I've learned that love, the kind of love I have for you, can give us courage we never knew we had." Marianne paused, looking at the framed photo of Ruby on her desk. Her daughter's bright smile and curious eyes reminded her of all they'd overcome together. She continued writing, "The woman I am today is someone I'm proud to be, someone who fights for truth, who believes in second chances, and who knows that real strength often comes from admitting when we need help." A knock at her classroom door made her look up. It was Sarah again. "Still here? You're glowing, by the way. Whatever you're writing must be good." Marianne closed her journal, smiling as she traced its worn cover. "Just reflecting on how far we've come." "We've all noticed," Sarah said softly. "You're not the same person who started this school year." "No," Marianne agreed, her eyes falling on Ruby's photo. "I'm stronger than ever." The autumn breeze rustled through the remaining leaves on the maple trees as Marianne stepped into her backyard, carrying Ruby on her hip. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dewy grass, where a small hole had been carefully dug near the garden fence. A young oak sapling waited nearby, its roots wrapped in burlap. Darnell arrived first, wearing a warm flannel shirt and work gloves. His gentle smile put Marianne at ease, as it always did. Robert pulled up moments later, looking slightly uncomfortable but determined. He carried a bag of rich soil and some garden tools. "Thank you both for coming," Marianne said, setting Ruby down. The toddler immediately wobbled toward the pile of dirt, fascinated by the texture. "Careful there, little one," Darnell chuckled, watching Ruby pat the soil with her tiny hands. They gathered around the hole and Robert broke the silence first. "I brought some fertilizer too. Helps with, strong roots and all that." Marianne nodded, appreciating the metaphor even if Robert hadn't intended it. They worked together, removing the burlap from the sapling's roots and positioning it carefully in the hole. Ruby squealed with delight as she threw handfuls of dirt, most of it missing the target entirely. "I never thought I'd be here," Darnell said softly, tamping down soil around the base of the tree. "A year ago, I was sitting in a cell, thinking I'd never see the sky as a free man again." He paused, emotion catching in his throat. "Now I'm here. watching my daughter play in the sunshine. It's more than I ever dared hope for." Robert shifted his weight, clearly moved by Darnell's words but struggling to find his own. "I know I've got a long way to go," he finally managed. "The way I acted, well, I'm trying to do better, for Ruby's sake." Marianne watched as Ruby toddled between the three adults, completely unaware of the complex emotions swirling around her. "She deserves all of us at our best," Marianne said, reaching down to wipe a smudge of dirt from Ruby's cheek. "And somehow, through everything that's happened, she's brought out the best in each of us." They worked quietly for a few minutes, adding soil and water, making sure the sapling stood straight and strong. Ruby helped by splashing in the water puddles and giggling at her own reflection. As they finished, Darnell stepped back to admire their work. "You know, trees need all kinds of things to grow. Good soil, water, sunlight. Kind of like people need different kinds of support to thrive." Robert nodded, finally meeting Darnell's eyes. "Yeah, I'm starting to understand that better now." Marianne took Ruby's hand, both of them dirty but happy, and looked at their newly planted tree. "This is for you, sweet girl," she said softly. "A reminder that we can always grow." The evening sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. As Marianne settled into her favorite porch chair, Ruby nestled contentedly in her lap. The autumn air carried the crisp scent of fallen leaves, and in the corner of the yard, their newly planted oak sapling swayed gently in the breeze. "Look at the pretty colors, sweetheart," Marianne whispered, pointing to the sunset. Ruby's tiny finger followed her mother's gesture, her brown eyes wide with wonder. The peaceful moment brought tears to Marianne's eyes as she remembered the tumultuous path that led them here. She thought of James Cooper, whose determination helped uncover the truth about Darnell's case. The private investigator had gone above and beyond, spending countless hours piecing together evidence that others had overlooked. Karen Daniels crossed her mind too, the brave whistleblower who risked her career to expose the fertility clinic's negligence. Without Karen's courage, the truth might never have come to light. Her testimony had not only validated Marianne's experience, but had also prompted the clinic to implement stricter protocols to prevent future mix-ups. Ruby squirmed in her lap, reaching toward a pair of cardinals flying overhead. Her delighted giggle echoed across the yard, and Marianne hugged her closer, breathing in the sweet baby shampoo scent of her hair. Darnell's impact on their lives had been unexpected but profound. His quiet strength throughout his wrongful imprisonment, his graceful handling of freedom, and his gentle approach to building a relationship with both his daughters had taught Marianne valuable lessons about forgiveness and resilience. Even Robert's recent efforts to make amends, though initially awkward, showed that people could grow and change when they chose to put their children's needs first. The memory of their shared moment planting the tree brought a small smile to her face. The setting sun cast long shadows across their yard, and Ruby pointed excitedly at the changing patterns. Marianne felt a deep sense of contentment settle in her chest. The challenges they'd faced had been daunting, but they'd emerged stronger, surrounded by a network of support she never expected to have. Looking toward the future, Marianne no longer felt the anxiety that had once plagued her sleepless nights. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she knew they could face them together. Ruby's presence in her life had given her a strength she never knew she possessed. "Bird!" Ruby exclaimed, pointing at a sparrow hopping along the porch railing. Her vocabulary grew daily, each new word a reminder of how far they'd come and how much lay ahead. As the sun dips below the horizon, Marianne hugs Ruby tightly and whispers, "This is only the beginning, my love. The best is yet to come." If you enjoyed the story of Marianne, I handpicked this next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.